Welcome to the Forced Adversity podcast. Also, FAP is acceptable as long as you don't say it in some kind of jokey, perverted way. We take things really serious around here, so, none of that. This first episode is awesome. And of course, I'm going to say that because it's my podcast, but really, I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out. For some reason, old Goatface smiled up at me and gave me the best possible co-host I could ask for in Morgan. If you want to know about how this podcast kind of was conceptualized, what the inspiration for it was, you can check out episode 0. It's the first video on this channel. The dedication, the consistency, the passion, and the fact that Morgan just gets it, where I'm coming from. What I'm trying to explore here. I see this as Morgan's show as much as my own. But that's not even the end of my good fortune when it comes to this podcast. When we announced the podcast in the fall, I put out a list of the topics, that we plan to cover just to kind of give my YouTube audience and, a look at what we're planning to do. After all, they knew the name Forced Adversity because that was the previous name of my channel. And, I'd kept it in my back pocket for just such an occasion. Anyway, so when I put out that list, I fairly quickly received a message from a guy that I did not know. And usually in my line of work, that can be a pretty bad experience, but not in this case. Ryan of the YouTube channel Nothing But Media was offering his expertise as a media studies graduate and as an actual citizen of the UK for the topic you'll hear today, video nasties. He was obviously smart because he's got a Welsh accent, and as an American, I'm programmed to see him as my superior in intellect and sophistication. How else do you explain Sargon of Akkad? This was all of our first episode of the podcast, and Ryan was intended to be, the first of hopefully many guests to come. He came in like a professional, which is great because Morgan and I aren't, and he left having set a standard for not just guests, but episode structure, rhythm, tone, that we couldn't have possibly expected or asked for. And he did it for free. But since then, Morgan and I have gotten to know Ryan and become rather fond of the guy. And when it became clear that we needed, a third body to throw at this work, there was never a second option for us. So despite Ryan being introduced as just a guest of this episode, this was recorded in October. And as of January, Ryan is a co-host as well. And I just want to express my deepest gratitude to Ryan and Morgan for, seeing the potential in this and believing in it and putting so much of themselves into it and bolstering it with their talents and their personalities and their presence to something that I could not have achieved on my own. Also, thank you, Jennifer, Matt, Willow, Perp, and everyone who's been such a positive force in my life. I pretty regularly dive into the shittiest people who say the shittiest things and do the shittiest things. And it would be pretty easy for me to get kind of overwhelmed by that and become numb and bitter. Yet all of you and my awesome audience on YouTube, and of course my kid, you remind me that not everyone here is that fucked up and cold. Enjoy episode 1 of the Forced Adversity podcast.
The only way that you can really stop this kind of thing is to arouse public opinion. It's very upsetting. It has a bad moral effect.
Forced adversity.
Ask yourself, what's more terrifying, fear or the frightened?
The facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
Bad, B-A-D-D, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons.
Up yours, woke moralists.
Socialism has spread the shadow of human regimentation over most of the nations of the earth.
And they're pushing identity politics with this. They 100% are.
How do you think homosexuals reveal themselves?
And the shadow is encroaching upon our own liberty.
I think there ought to be a law against them. Tonight I'm going to show you why.
Oh, you should probably introduce yourself. We should start with that.
Hello there. My name is Ryan, and I run the Nothing But Media YouTube channel, where I look at generally older films and TV programs that I enjoy and that I hope others will enjoy. But part of that comes with my love for both history and entertainment. And so my roots in that go right back to childhood and all the way up to my degree and my personal interest in media and performance, really. My degree was in media studies and theatre and media drama, so I was a critic and a person to be criticised as an actor and a journalist, certainly at degree level. And that's where my experience lies in regards to this topic that we'll be talking about today.
And that topic is video nasties.
If anyone can stand up and defend the sort of horrific scenes that I have had to see and other members of Parliament have had to see, I believe they're living in a different world to that world that I live in. I believe that research is taking place, and it will show that these films not only affect young people, but I believe they affect adults as well.
Video nasties was a term coined by Mary Whitehouse, and she took against a whole bunch of movies that became available in the early 80s on video.
The police have raided many video shops in the past months.
The people who say, but why shouldn't adults be able to see this kind of thing in their own home? I'm half tempted to say that people who make that kind of demand, knowing that children are likely to see it, aren't really themselves very mature and adult.
Video nasties is a term associated with the period of panic and censorship in the UK during the rise of the popularity of video cassettes. And the video nasties is a list of films that were censored and banned that now wear that video nasty stamp like a badge of honor. Looking back, it seems pretty blown out of proportion, but it's a fascinating piece of film history that still has rippling effects to this day. So thank you, Ryan. And what I guess where would we start is just like how did this start?
Well, the nasty behind the video nasty.
That's a good way of putting it, actually, the nasty behind the video nasties. Well, the roots of the video nasty moral panic actually began with one single person, and a surprising person, an art teacher named Mary Whitehouse, who was a perfectly normal housewife, but whose strict religious beliefs led her to campaign for decades against what she saw as the moral decay of social liberalism, as she called it. And that is the strict definition of social liberalism, not the more politically motivated version that we sometimes hear today. This was the modern liberal society of the 1960s. So she began her campaign initially to clean up TV in 1963. And that spread out then to all forms of media over the years. And she was actually incredibly successful at getting things banned or censored. This was long before social media and cancel culture, as it's now called, but she did it all with simple letter writing campaigns to the heads of TV networks or magazines or publishing companies, things like that, and then grassroots organizing through various different church groups, which had a similar strict religious belief system to her, and which she was able to then use to gain momentum at incredible speed, considering this was the age of the telephone and the letter. Her targets were basically everything. Anything that included any kind of mass media that covered sexual content, violence, any suggestion of homosexuality, bad language, and even news reports that covered things like war in any sort of graphic detail. One of her targets was a repeat of coverage of the liberation of the Belsen concentration camp in the 60s, which she described as filth that was bound to shock and offend. So you can understand from that this was sometimes very misplaced.
So I have a question about these churches. So I don't know anything about the religious makeup of the UK beyond the Church of England and the sort of historical conflicts they have. What sort of churches made up these sort of reactionary groups that she wrangled together to push for all this?
Well, the way Christianity works in the UK is very denominational. It's very splintered. So we have the Catholic Church and we have the Church of England. Those are the two main churches, and we've fought long and hard over that over the last 500 years since the establishment of the Church of England. The Church of England tends to be slightly more liberal in its outlook. They have female vicars, they have gay vicars, whereas obviously the Catholic Church doesn't have any, openly, I should say, gay priests or any women heading their congregations. But then there are also smaller denominations, and these break down into, there's Baptists, there's Protestants, which I think are slightly different again to the Church of England. There's evangelical, which obviously I know you have in the States, but is slightly different here. We don't have mega churches. The population is not sort of set up for that the way our cities and towns work.
Keep at it. You guys might get lucky, you know?
You don't want those. Let me tell you, those don't do any good for you.
Well, I don't think we've got the room, honestly. We're a small country, and sometimes it comes with benefits that you can't have huge mega-seater stadiums full of people going and worshipping at the feet of one man who isn't God, but has as much money as God.
Ladies and gentlemen, the bloodiest thing that ever happened in front of a camera. Snuff. This is the true story of 4 innocent young actresses who thought they were making just another movie, but didn't know they were making the ultimate movie.
You will feel the pain, and you will not flinch from it.
Here in the U.S., typically, almost always, the very reactionary, religious sects tend to be, hand in hand with the right-wing political sphere. Is there a similar thing in the UK?
There certainly is, or there certainly was. It seems to be dying off now over the last sort of 20 or 30 years. For example, Margaret Thatcher, who was indeed this very right-wing Prime Minister, and who I'll come on to talk about her involvement in this, she hadn't gone to church as a child, but found religion later in life. So there is definitely a connection there, although it definitely was stronger at the time that Mary Whitehouse was leading her campaign. It was much more difficult to be integrated politically and religiously. There is a separation of church and state, although there isn't an official one. So it's very rare that you will have religion mentioned within the House of Commons, for example, our main parliamentary unit. So while religion may inform our politicians, I don't feel like they would ever outwardly admit it in Parliament. But certainly in their private lives, and if they're speaking to the media, it might be something they would talk about. But that was sort of how she operated as well. She would somehow have the ear of the people running the BBC, for example, using connections within the church, sort of working her way, networking. Mary Whitehouse was able to get in touch with people in positions in media who were sympathetic to her cause from a religious perspective. So there definitely was a connection, although it wasn't as obvious as you might expect today.
There is a bit of similarities with, different kind of media panics that have happened in the U.S. But yeah, the distinctions are notable and pretty fascinating. So what were the what was the justification in in the government's mind for saying, hey, this is over the line. You can't just have this stuff floating around, existing at all, is what it seems like. Was there any kind of legal basis for that?
Well, interestingly, the initial campaigns were based on purely appealing to taste and decency. So there were no... she would use legal means that already existed. We did have some pretty archaic laws on the books regarding obscenities. Our obscenity laws, which would have dated back, in some cases, hundreds of years, is what she used to initially target magazines and TV programs. Although she never successfully prosecuted any TV network, she did successfully prosecute a few magazines. And again, this is a time when magazines were plentiful and her targets were often small publishers. It was the growing gay rights movements that she would often target. To be fair to her, her targets weren't always ludicrous or what we would see as backwards looking, because one of the campaigns that she did lead successfully was actually against a pro-pedophilia group, and she managed to basically get them shut down. So to give her dues on that front, it wasn't purely the targets. The targets she was going after weren't purely what we would see as a religious reactionary type.
Sure. It seems like she just kind of had a fire hose strategy where just, aim for everything. And of course, she's probably going to hit one or two things that are valid.
Well, exactly. She had an idea of what moral decency was, and she was determined to uphold it. And the targets of that were sometimes justified.
So she was using primarily existing UK laws rather than advocating for new ones that sort of crop up with once we get to the video nasties.
That's right. Yeah. Typically, she would basically pursue private prosecutions. So she would fundraise through her various church groups, and if the letter writing campaigns didn't work, which in television they often did, but as far as magazines and some theatre productions go, she would actually directly pursue private legal methods.
What you're about to see may shock you. It may frighten you more than you've ever been frightened before. Don't worry, it's only a maddening, horrifying nightmare. Or is it?
What are you gonna do?
Fire some flares. Did you give her the pills like I told you?
No. Maybe it's not a nightmare after all.
There's nothing up here.
Are they really alone, or is there an unwelcome guest?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, got to give her credit for the pedophilia thing, getting that shut down, and also just, divorcing the absurdity of a lot of the stuff she was targeting from it. She seemed like she had an effective strategy, and especially pre-internet and social media, being able to get such a grassroots campaign going, it's somewhat impressive.
How successful she was. Yeah, it's incredible how successful she was at what started as one middle-aged woman on her own to becoming a figurehead for... Essentially, she became a figurehead for censorship in her later years.
Well, so moving into the video nasties themselves, were there any genesis point with a specific movie or set of movies that really, that she saw as the highlight or the example that she held up as, offensive beyond belief?
There was nothing really specific that she personally went into. An interesting thing happened around the sort of birth of VHS in the UK is that she objected generally, I guess you would say it, to probably, because it's almost certain that she never saw a single frame of any of the films she was complaining about. So it was almost certainly word of mouth, because I can remember every time she would go on TV, one of the questions would be, have you seen it? And she would say, I wouldn't watch this filth, and neither should you, basically. So there was no specific catalyst for it. It was just generally part of her sort of ethos that she heard about these films being incredibly violent and bringing down the moral standards, and that is why they became a target. And so it wasn't until she was able to work with Margaret Thatcher, who was sympathetic to her cause, that it really took off, and specific films began getting targeted.
All right. So, yeah, speaking of specific films, initially there were, 72 films?
There were, yes. There were 72 films on the initial list, and then others got added afterwards. Of those 72 video nasties, most of them are fairly forgettable titles that have naturally faded into obscurity. But there are a few films that are still considered either memorable or certainly horror classics. I mean, the main one I think to talk about would be The Evil Dead, because that has definitely transcended the level of video nasty that it was known as. And on record, this is known as one of Mary Whitehouse's most hated films on the list, although, again, as I said, it's very unlikely that she ever saw it.
If she's not watching these movies, who is putting this list? Like, who is deciding what movies go on here? Was there a big dartboard they had, or some sort of like dice rolling competition?
Well, the initial 72 were drawn up by the government, and her input, as I said, as far as I'm aware, or certainly what she said, I mean, it may be different. She may have watched several of these films, or at least to a point at which she found them too horrific to turn off. But she certainly always maintained that she would never watch the sort of films that she wanted to ban.
Which is interesting because, as some people that may be listening will know, the genesis of this podcast in general, the whole series is, I started by looking at the Comics Code and Frederick Wortham and his reaction to things, and then looking at, more modern comic book related elements like Comicsgate. And it's really something I see that both of these phenomenon share, is that you get people within Comicsgate or whatever who, seem to know so much about these things, and they label them as woke and have an agenda and all this stuff, but then they also, you can tell they don't read it, or they'll flat out tell you that they won't read it. So there's a little bit of a similarity there. I noticed that there are a couple of movies on the list that I think most people would agree have some elements that aren't great. Specifically with Evil Dead, there is the scene with the tree that attacks the character and sexually assaults her, being pretty, I think even Sam Raimi himself has said that he, doesn't really stand by that 100% like he did. And then there's also Cannibal Holocaust, which some people may know actually has examples of real animal harm. So that's interesting, but it may just be like if you pick out 72 random horror films, you're going to find some problematic elements no matter what.
Oh, yeah, and I would say some of the films were definitely problematic. I mean, as you identified in The Evil Dead, there is that scene which Sam Raimi has said he would never do again. And when he came to make The Evil Dead 2, there's a much, much more toned down version of that idea. And so maybe that was the sort of key reason, I can imagine, because the way I look at it is if you imagine somebody else who has seen the film describing it to Mary Whitehouse in the sort of the most salacious way, then that is the sort of thing that would make her ears prick up and be horrified for. So that certainly goes towards it.
Sure.
But what's interesting about the list of 72 is that 39 of those films were successfully prosecuted for obscenities reasons, and of the rest that were either not prosecuted at all or not prosecuted successfully, which included The Evil Dead, 62 have now been released either uncut or with minor cuts.
I spit on your grave. This woman will soon cut, chop, break, and burn 5 men beyond recognition. And there isn't a jury in this country that will convict her.
I was looking at that as well, that it's pretty amazing that, of course, now these things are easily accessible, and not only that, but they've kind of become legends within the horror community and, probably the film community at large.
And what's funny is that the 10 films that have never been released, they haven't been released in this country because they were never resubmitted for classification, most of them. There's a few that have been rejected for classification, but it seems like some of those films were just rushed out on the quick by studios that were interested in getting in on horror phenomena that went out of business, and probably the rights, who owns the rights to those films have been lost.
It's kind of all over the place from the horror genre in general that have just sort of been picked out of a hat over time to be their quality is all over the place, and they can kind of use that video nasty moniker now as a badge of honor almost.
Well, it's interesting. I was in an HMV store the other day, and on one of the end racks they had a promotional display which was titled Video Nasties, and it was DVDs of films that either were official video nasties or that these days people would fit into that genre, and they were using it as a promotional tool.
I guess one thing that's notable, right, is outside of the Mary Whitehouse of it all, the way that these conditions arose in the first place, right, was that in the 70s there was just a boom in kind of renegade filmmaking, right? And when a lot of that becomes, and as well as just cultural shifting from less conservative or more conservative media consumption. In the 70s, you had everything from vigilante films like Death Wish and just things got more violent in general, even outside of horror. It just became more common, partly due to these, kind of young renegade filmmakers. I guess that kind of created the conditions for someone to seize upon that, like Mary Whitehouse.
I think so, because she had been largely unsuccessful in prosecutions of films that would go to the cinema pre-VHS. When they would go to theatres and then disappear or only be shown every sort of so often, she had not done very well. Part of the reason for that was because the way that the film classification system worked over here. So in the 70s, local councils were directly responsible for whether a film would be shown or not, rather than they would be rated by our film classification system, but then it was up to the council whether they were allowed to be shown or not. So an example of this, one of her successes, really her only significant success in the theatre, was she managed to get Monty Python's Life of Brian banned by a few local councils.
Wow, I can see someone of her mindset going after that movie, but it's a pretty funny movie.
Well, the religious right in this country were very much dead against it. There is there's footage of some of the Pythons on a chat show with with a priest in one of these sort of antagonistic interviews where he's challenging the blasphemy of their film, and they're arguing against it, and they very much come out on top. But a weird quirk of this ban, like I said, it was only a few councils it extended to. One of those councils was actually one here in Wales, where I'm from, and years later they would elect a woman named Sue Jones-Davis as their mayor, and she had actually played Judith Iscariot in that film.
Small world. So I have a question about your rating system, because over in the States, we have, I believe the MPAA is private. It's sort of run by the film industry, and the government isn't really involved at all. How is the UK's Film Advisory Council, you said, or what was it called?
It's called the British Board of Film Classification. It used to be called the British Board of Film Censorship, but that changed pre-Video Nasties.
Okay,
yeah, that's an ugly word. You don't want that in your institution.
No. So it was changed to classifications. I did, I actually forgot that I did want to mention that, because there are significant differences with the two systems, and yet they end up working in exactly the same way. The BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, unlike the MPAA in the US, they're responsible for giving every film a certification which says whether anybody's allowed to see it and what the age restrictions are. They have to rate every film that's shown in cinemas and every home movie release, whether that was formerly VHS or is now DVD or Blu-ray. It doesn't extend to streaming, which is interesting, but it does cover all other physical home media. And they're a government organization, and they're set up to do that via the government, and they have a say over whether a film is passed or not, and whether it's viewable in this country, which obviously I guess is something that's much harder in an internet age. But my understanding of the way the MPAA works is that you don't have to submit a film to the MPAA in order to release it, but if you don't submit it to the MPAA, no cinema will screen it. Is that about right?
That's about right.
Essentially, even though it seems like our system might be more against free speech and however you want to phrase it, the end goal is the same. They decide what films people get to see and what they don't get to see, and it's just two different groups doing it.
Right. There's the interests are different, the people involved are different, but the goals are not indistinct.
And that's really how the Video Nasties came to be, because at the advent of VHS, the BBFC were specifically related to cinema releases. And so the loophole that allowed home movies to be released in the way they were is because it wasn't part of the BBFC's remit.
You see, everyone thought Stanley was a joke. An outcast with no one to turn to.
You guys broke my catapult. You're gonna pay for that.
No one except man's most advanced machine. Stanley used the power of man to call on the powers of evil.
Oh my God.
And all hell broke loose.
Imbue these creatures with your strength and force. Let them avenge
me. Evil speak.
Which I'm sure that they were not happy with, just on a kind of establishment perspective.
And it's really interesting that the BBFC as a sort of government department, if you like, was relatively hands-off where they could be. They didn't like to make censorship choices. They would much rather favour demanding cuts, and sometimes the cuts happened and sometimes they didn't. I think there's a few cases in the States of this happening as well, where somebody would be sent a film back and asked to make certain cuts, and then they just never made it, and then they would resubmit the film and it would be passed because nobody would bother to watch it a second time.
It's happened a couple of times, yeah. It's so inconsistent. There's an example of pretty much everything. How quickly did this all unfold? Like, basically, once the government stepped in and decided, we're going to essentially ban these films. How quickly did it take place? What were the actions that were taken? The literal actions? Did they go and try and seize copies of these VHS or?
Well, it was relatively quick, bearing in mind the history of the VHS market, which I don't know a huge amount about because this was before my time. But we got our first VHS players in 1978, but at that time, very few people could afford them because they were about £600 to £800 for a VHS player, which I think at the time would have been roughly the same dollar equivalent, and nowadays would be about 4,000 or 5,000. And VHS tapes, when they first came out, were sold at an enormously high markup, which is why rental places sprung up.
Right.
So most of what we're talking about, certainly in the early days, are rental tapes rather than for purchase. You could buy a blank VHS in 1980, I think, for about £10, which is the equivalent of about £50 today. And I think the dollar price was roughly the same. It was about $10, which would equate probably to around $50 or $60 today, and that's for a blank. So for an actual studio released film, it was about 8 or 10 times that price. So it really wasn't accessible to the whole market until a bit later on in the early 80s when the panic started. But right. It was really the rental market that was targeted initially. So what the government did was changes were made to the laws, which meant that basically they selected which films were going to be banned. The weird thing about that is they didn't have somebody going through and picking every film off that list. They just seemed to pick the ones that sounded like they were bad, usually probably from what was the sort of marketing blurb on the backs of the boxes.
Wow. That actually is interesting because I've been looking at some of the blurbs and the marketing blurbs and whatnot, and I can see that. I can see how, because there's some films like Trauma. They're from 1976. It's just a film called Trauma, and that doesn't seem extremely incendiary or graphic just based on the title.
Is it the 1984 Trauma?
1976.
1976, right. Because there's about a dozen films called Trauma.
Oh, sure. So just on the cover, on the poster, there's a man stabbed in the back, laying on the ground, dying. There's one woman with her shirt open, and you can see her bra. And there's another woman whose dress top has been torn off, and she's just holding it up against her. Yeah, very. I think that's what did it.
Yeah, so this was one of the 39 that was actually prosecuted as well. But what's interesting about this is I was just looking because I was interested in the cast list for it because I was interested whether it was a European film or not. But
Udo Kier?
yeah, Udo Kier is the obvious one, which made me think it was European. But I think this is a British film, weirdly.
And it looks like the original title was Expose, which may have had something to do with making it sound more salacious too.
Have you noticed a pattern of how they treated films that were made in the UK or by creators from the UK elsewhere, or making films elsewhere? What was the likelihood, or did that impact what was allowed through and not allowed through? If it was your homeboy making a movie versus if it was just something imported from Hollywood?
It didn't really, no. The main targets for the Video Nasties were US films and European, specifically Italian films, just because they were generating so many different horror films, almost homemade, some of them.
Right.
So there were British films on the list, but the fact is the British film industry at that time was on the decline. This was after Hammer and Amicus and all of those companies that had made a fortune making horror films, and it was after our comedy boom of the sort of the Pinewood Studios Carry On films and the Ealing comedies. So British cinema was on the so we just weren't making that many films. So there are some British films on the list, but I don't think there was any special leeway given to British films or British filmmakers. Realistically, most of the films to a certain point seem to have been completely chosen at random, either based on the cover art or having been told that the films weren't suitable and things like that. It's really amazing. It's almost amazing at the films that are missing as much as the films that are on the list.
Well, that's a good question. What films do you think are missing? Like what, and why do you think they got away with it?
Well, the one obvious one for me of the 80s films is Hellraiser, which I think is the title it has the word hell in it, so immediately it's sort of red flagged. The content of it is fairly graphic violence in places. There's obviously the sexual connotations, the sadomasochistic element, and yet it seemed to escape from any sort of censorship in the UK.
That is genuinely shocking.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and what stands out to me again, to compare to more modern or recent moral panics, is that there's another thing that I'm seeing repeated, and I'm sure as we go through the podcast, covering other topics, we'll see this again. Like you're saying, that they kind of just pick things at random, or and in some cases, I imagine based on word of mouth. Like someone just explains what this movie's about, and then we're adding that to the list, and it's kind of highlighted by when you look at things like the current anti-trans panic in the US and I think in the UK too, where it's just a mishmash of beliefs and criteria that are inconsistent and can't be applied consistently. And I think that's what happens with these kind of knee-jerk reactions to cultural or social changes.
I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, you look at the current trans panic, and it really is a moral panic because transgender people have been part of our history for as long as our history goes back. And the way that they are attempting to, it's a sort of scattergun approach, and there are many targets that they're going after that don't actually have anything to do with even transgenderism, like obviously the panic over drag queens. And
yes,
Britain has a long history of drag, and that seems to have been, for want of a better word, dragged into the trans panic, because drag queens, generally speaking, are either straight or gay cis men. They're not transgender.
It has the appearance of, and if you're looking to work on that narrative, if you don't know any better, to go back to Hellraiser, I don't know anything about Hellraiser. I've seen the first one once and then never again. Never again. I am not a horror movie person. I like horror aspects in other movies, but a horror movie is a little much for me. But like, if I didn't know anything about Clive Barker or that whole franchise beyond that movie, I might think that like, they made the new Pinhead a trans person. Like that would be like, oh no, what are they doing? But then when you look into the history of that, it's sort of baked into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of round that all off on this specific tangent, it really is. The whole drag queen thing highlights the fact that it's not just we don't like trans people, although that's part of it, but it's really just any kind of challenge to social norms. And I think that applies to probably any moral panic when it revolving around a cultural or social shift.
Well, what's interesting as well is sort of bringing it back into the 1980s is that during the 80s there was sort of a big gay rights push, but also this was the time of androgyny in music. I mean, if you think about acts like Boy George, who a lot of people thought was a woman, and Annie Lennox, who certainly presented herself as masculine, and people like David Bowie, there was a level of androgyny in the 80s that we just don't see within the fashion world today, and yet the trans panic definitely would have included those figures on its hit list, I feel, if they were coming through now.
I imagine that even like rock bands like Led Zeppelin would have been, included in that. There was definitely a lot of, feminine dress and movement and long hair with some of those 70s rock bands and 80s rock bands, especially in the 80s.
Nothing will prepare you for the horror of these butchers of the damned. Nothing will protect you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the bloodiest thing that ever happened in front of a camera.
The initial list is it's almost laughable looking at the first list of the 72 today, because I defy anyone to. I know there's somebody who has actually gone through and attempted to own and watch all 72, and I don't know how successful they've been, because I imagine a couple of these titles have been lost forever, but most of them I had never heard of.
Same.
And there's a few on there that stand out, and I think we'll probably come on to that. But yeah, what's really interesting is how bad the British legal system was at going after these films. Now, I know you asked earlier about how they did it, and you were quite right. They literally would go into a video shop and take the titles off the shelves. The only problem with that is in a pre-computer age, the police would have a typed list of the films and would pick those films off the list based on the title. And so you had these weird things happening where there's a film called Death Trap on the list, but there's another film also called Death Trap starring Michael Caine and Christopher Reeve, which is a sort of a thriller based on a play. And they confiscated that version of Death Trap as well as the actual one that they were trying to, because they just didn't know what was what. It got so bad, in fact, that the Burt Reynolds and Dolly Parton musical, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, was taken off shelves and confiscated by police because they thought it was a porn film.
Well, wow. Look, I'll be honest. When I was a kid, I stumbled across that movie like on HBO or something, and I got real excited and like, oh, I found something I'm not supposed to see, and it was not what I was expecting, and I'll never forgive it. Okay.
And it was Dolly Parton.
I didn't have the appreciation for Dolly yet that I do now, so I should probably go back and check it out.
You probably enjoy it now. It is a sort of classic of the that musical genre, like Little Shop of Horrors or the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is camp but also with an edge.
Yeah.
But as you said, you brought up the film Trauma. Now, how many other films are called Trauma? How many other films have used that title? I mean, some of them, yeah, there's no escaping what the title is. Like Prisoner of the Cannibal God. I can't imagine a film like that would be confused with a different version, perhaps Steven Spielberg's Prisoner of the Cannibal God. But yeah, others. There's a film called Pranks and a film called Possession. And just to get out of the peas, there's a film called The Funhouse. Now, if you're going in and you're just picking titles based on their title, mistakes will be made, and they were.
So were these just local cops sent in to harangue video rental stores, or was this like the department of the federal police of going and grabbing movies off the shelves.
No, it really was local cops. It was fax machines and typed lists sent to different police forces, and it was down to the discretion of the commanding officers as to how vehemently they would pursue it. In the bigger cities, probably more so than the towns and villages whose local video shop probably wouldn't have stocked most of these titles anyway. And then there would have been a few video shops which definitely would have stocked these titles because they knew that those are the titles that people would go on based on the cover art and the description on the back of the box.
New Orleans, Mardi Gras, masks, and murder. The Mardi Gras Massacre. Homicide. Beautiful women are dying, and so are the New Orleans cops. As they battle a bloodthirsty madman, a masked monster, Mardi Gras Massacre.
Scrolling through the list of these titles is wild, though. Just, you've got things like Trauma, and now you've got the I'm sure that Matt Walsh is going to make a remake any minute now, the SS Experiment Love Camp from 1976.
Oh, boy. I imagine the UK was a little bit inclined to react to anything that seemed to depict Nazis in anything other than a horrible light.
Interestingly enough, probably not, because if you watch any comedy from the 70s or 80s, you'll find sketches about the Nazis, or have Spike Milligan very famously used to dress up as Hitler all the time for a lot of his sketches, and there's a slightly less well-regarded comedian called Freddie Starr who part of his act was dressing as Hitler.
You should always satirize fascists and terrible people, but like when it comes to a movie like The Gestapo's Last Orgy, I imagine which is on this list, I imagine they viewed that a little bit differently.
It would be fascinating to know which part of that they objected to, the Gestapo or the orgy bit.
Right.
We may never know.
All right, everyone out of the truck. Hurry up. Get down.
Past and future no longer exist for you. You are going to serve a victorious cause for our Third Reich.
One thing that I'm curious about is the Streisand effect, so it's called, right? Where you call attention to something that really wasn't as big a deal until you called attention to it, and now you've got people super fascinated in it. Was that kind of a part of the phenomenon? It definitely is now. It has become that since then, but even during the time that this is going on, did you have more people going, wait, now what are these movies they're banning? I want to find this movie.
100%. That is exactly what happened. I mean, you couldn't have expressed it any better, to be honest. Films that otherwise might have been rented by one or two people in their time in the video shop were now like gold dust, and everybody was seeking them out. Certain films rose to the top in a list of, oh, you've got to see this. Usually in the schoolyard. I mean, that's where I heard about it. In the playground, some kid would claim to have seen a film that they obviously hadn't seen because years later their description of it was wildly different from what the film actually contained. The big one there was Faces of Death, which did become legendary.
It did.
more so than any other title.
Besides Evil Dead, which, actually became a genuine film classic, but like Faces of Death was something that when I was in high school, it would get passed around. You'd go stay the night at your buddy's house and have a few people over, and one of them would go, "Hey, have you seen Faces of Death?" I'm like, no, what is that? And well, it's got these real death scenes in it. Like, uh-oh. And you're watching it feeling like you're watching something you shouldn't. And even probably 9th grade of high school, I thought it was real. I was like, wow. And I was genuinely uncomfortable about it, and was like, yeah, I understand why this has been banned in so many countries and stuff. But yeah, it turns out it was only like the setups were real. So it would show like a car accident that was real, but then it would cut to, staged footage of, bodies laying around or whatever.
Yeah, and there were a few different examples of these sorts of titles. Faces of Death is really the pinnacle, but the other one, The Driller Killer, is another title I remember rattling around the playground. I Spit on Your Grave was another one where people would talk about it without actually ever having seen it. Certainly not at sort of 7 or 8 years of age when I was hearing about these films. But the funny thing is, like, talking about these sorts of films, the extreme examples, there were more arty films on that list, the sort of the things that were coming out of Italy. Some of those were very art house horror films, and funnily enough, those were the ones that weren't really talked about because nobody wanted to see an experimental Italian art house film when they were 8 or 9 years of age.
Yeah, I'm definitely, one thing I'm seeing here that stands out is a few, let's see, Dario Argento films, who is now regarded as, one of the greatest horror masters in film history. And it's just, like you said earlier, the range of quality of, not just production, but like the subject matter of these films is wild.
Filthy, slimy pervert.
I've read all your books, Mr. Neal. The book deals with a murder committed with an old-fashioned open razor, right? This girl, too, was killed with a razor, and your book's pages stuffed into her mouth.
Can I ask you something? If someone is killed with a Smith & Wesson revolver, do you go and interview the president of Smith & Wesson?
Yeah, and the Giallo films have definitely become, they've become a genre in their own rights, but they were one of the groups of films that were lumped in with the video nasties because, yeah, they are incredibly graphic in places. I mean, that's sort of part of the thing, but it's within the context.
So, obviously this was kind of a grassroots campaign by White House, and then I imagine eventually was grasped onto by, religious movements and then entered the political sphere and became actual law. But like, how much were the general public, in agreement with what was happening? Was there a whole lot of actual moral panic in, the general populace, or was this mostly, kind of forced?
Well, it's funny because I think to begin with, the general population didn't care. Most people at that time, when it first started, didn't own a VHS player. And when they did start to get more popular, most people had a relatively liberal attitude to it. The difference really was the tabloid press, who play a huge part in the UK in stoking fear and panic against anything that they decide is going to sell their newspapers. And so that's where the moral panic lived and died. And people were getting upset because of the panic generated by the press. But generally, it didn't have that much of an effect because at that time, people just didn't believe that a film could really upset the status quo of the nation. They really didn't believe the power of cinema was that great. So most people, it just didn't affect their daily lives. Most people didn't want to see these gross horror films anyway. Certainly anyone over the age of probably 30 wasn't interested in seeing them unless they were a film fan. And so really, it was the idea of it poisoning the youth. But then because VHS players and VHSs were, to begin with, so difficult to get a hold of, it never really caught on. It was never a case of parents fearing that their children might get to see one of these films, because as a general rule, kids wouldn't get to see them. It did happen. Certainly there were parents who were a little bit more liberal, who didn't really pay attention to what their kids were watching, and those would be the houses that you would go around to watch these sorts of films. But no, it didn't really create much of a moral panic amongst the general populace. And I feel like part of that is it wasn't attached to anything. most people didn't care about the degradation of society or the social liberalization of the country in the same way that Mary Whitehouse did. So you might get parents who wouldn't want their kids watching the films and who might not allow their kids to watch these films, but as a general rule, there was no real moral panic.
So it was kind of the government reacting to just her campaign and her people's grassroots efforts than it was a broad public upswell. And it was just sort of fed on over the years by the tabloid media.
Absolutely, yeah. It was never a vote winner, but it also wasn't a vote loser. And so Margaret Thatcher was able to pursue her own sort of moral agenda while not really affecting her electoral chances. Because to be honest, at that time, the high levels of unemployment in the country meant that people were far more concerned about getting a job than they were about watching a film with horror elements in it.
Right. That makes sense. Is there another example of this sort of tabloid panic being a catalyst or something that continues and plays forward a legal trend like this, where something gets banned or legislated and then the tabloids jump on it and sort of push the attention on it forward in a negative way like this?
There probably are. Nothing is coming to mind strictly to do with the sort of legal element of it. I'm sure there are examples of legislation coming in recent years and the tabloids going after it. But generally speaking, the tabloids tend to operate almost in a renegade way. So, for example, there was a big moral panic about the apparent rise in paedophilia in the country, probably about 25 years ago, the late 90s, early 2000s. And this moral panic, created entirely within the tabloid press, resulted in one case, a pediatrician's house being graffitied because the idiots reading the newspapers thought that pediatrician and paedophile were synonymous, and they had looked this person up in the phone book.
That is impressively ignorant.
It's kind of comforting, at least, to know that Americans aren't the only illiterate ones.
We are not the only stupid people on the planet. We did it! Yay! Or at least we found someone who's stupid.
You really have to credit them with the different levels of stupidity. I mean, not just confusing pediatrician for paedophile, but thinking that a paedophile would advertise themselves in the telephone directory. It's
right.
Really quite incredible. But this is the way that the tabloids operate. They sell more papers if they are able to create scandal. There was a time when the tabloids really did a lot of what we would call love rat stories. So they would find a woman who had slept with somebody famous and give them some money for doing an interview about how that person had sex with them. And that was a big thing for a while. And as that trend moved on, they moved on to other stuff. And at the moment, it's crazy because they can't find something that really captures the imagination of the whole country. So it's either immigrants, or it's the EU, or it's COVID, and it's all a bit crazy. But yeah, I don't think there's ever been a moral panic in the same way that the Video Nasties one operated within the press. Not since the Video Nasties thing anyway. There have been past examples you could look at, and I believe in a future episode you'll possibly be looking at the mods and the rockers.
Yes.
That is on the to-do list.
That's another example of a moral panic that was exacerbated probably by the press. But I don't really think any legislation was brought in to deal with that. So other than, again, using existing laws.
The tabloids that played a big role in pushing this forward, did other newspapers that weren't as sensational or TV media or radio play a similar role, or they just sort of stayed out of it like the average person just wasn't really all that tuned into it?
Well, there are different rules that govern broadcast media as opposed to newspaper media. So television, they have to have much more journalistic integrity than the tabloids do. And so it never really spread to television news in the same way. It would more be a feature of TV magazine shows. So you might have debates on the issue. You might have opposing arguments from people from the film industry and people in the church or in politics, rather than it actually being fed by the news. And those discussions would tend to be more even-handed.
Who's there?
Prepare for a lesson in terror. Night School.
It's all pretty fascinating. I can't help but, my mind goes to more modern examples, obviously. And so, whenever you look at how the tabloids played such a huge role, and, we have our tabloids to this day still in the U.S., and they say some pretty absurd stuff, but generally they don't get the same traction that they used to. Anyway, most people recognize like the supermarket tabloids as just that. But the scary thing is that now, corporate mainstream media outlets have adopted a lot of those same tactics, and especially one or two in particular.
Well, it seems to be certainly something that the internet has become a useful idiot for, is presenting these extreme hyperbole, often largely factually incorrect or just completely made up, that pushes a narrative and uses examples that it makes up that they assume their audience is, I don't know, either too dumb or too lazy to look up for themselves. And in some cases, it often is the truth. And this seems to be the role that certain sections of the internet has inherited from the tabloids of the past.
And I think that probably we're going to dedicate at least one episode to all those various different, sections of the internet, as well as, throughout history, pre-internet.
So once all this comes to a close, what does the film industry look like going forward once these laws begin to relax?
Well, not a lot changes, really. An interesting thing that happens in regards to the video nasties themselves, the ones that were directly affected either in the first list of 72 or the later list of added films, is that as a general rule, most of them get passed for cinema, either completely uncut or with limited cuts of a few seconds here or there. And so it really didn't have the impact that it had intended. It certainly never stopped the film industry from continuing to make horror films or films of an adult nature. I mean, you look at some of the films in the second wave of video nasties, and there's a much more familiarity with those titles, I think, than in the first wave. So strange additions like Dawn of the Dead was one of the films that was originally passed but with quite a few cuts, and then eventually released uncut in 2003, as late as that. But then a film like The Thing, which was considered a video nasty as far as Mary Whitehouse's organization was concerned, but was uncut in the cinema and came out on video uncut in 1987, 5 years after it was released. But still, the video industry did move much more slowly then. And so, yeah, it seems like there was no societal difference caused by the banning of certain films, and there was no real difference in the way film was treated. It certainly didn't make any filmmakers any sort of more careful, because most of the titles were American or Italian or other European countries, films that would be released in their countries largely uncut. And so Britain wasn't really much of a factor financially to affect how the films were getting made.
Right. Those films are still going to get released in other countries to wider audiences. The UK, for as culturally important we think of it as, has a comparatively small geographic footprint and population. So people are still going to keep making whatever they're going to make elsewhere. And then if the UK wanted it, they would just let it in.
Yeah, and it would inevitably it would end up here anyway, because somebody would bring a copy over, and that copy would get copied 1,000 times, and those copies would get copied 1,000 times, and so they realized that they were fighting a losing battle.
Right. I find it interesting that The Thing made it was that let me start again. I find it interesting when you bring up The Thing that Mary Whitehouse had her own sort of idea of what a video nasty was that had by that point become separate from what the government was considering a video nasty.
That seems to be what tends to happen, right? Where, an attempt or an actual clamp down on something like cultural communication or whatever, it's always so ill-defined that it can end up growing and encompassing, other things. And especially somebody like Mary Whitehouse, who was so, religiously inspired to do what she was doing. You're going to find excuses to go after pretty much anything.
Well, part of the reason for that as well is that the chairman of the BBFC during this whole period, a man named James Furman, despite having some questionable choices, which I can talk about, was fairly liberal in his beliefs and would regularly sort of argue with Whitehouse about the choices that she made, because I'm sure her choice would have been to ban all of these films, but he actually came from a filmmaking background as well. So I think he very much fought for film in this case. Although, having said that, as I said, he had some questionable choices. For example, any film that featured nunchucks, including a scene in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 where Michelangelo uses sausages as nunchucks, had to be cut out because it was an illegal weapon in the UK.
Wow, I didn't realize. I knew about that. I knew about in the 80s and the Ninja Turtles that over in the UK there was a big uproar about nunchucks, and I don't know if any kids actually did hurt themselves.
Yeah, it's weird that they picked that as a weapon. I mean, I guess the thought process behind it was that it was an easy weapon to craft yourself. You couldn't make a sword yourself, but you could get two sticks with a bit of string between them and forge a pretty dangerous weapon. But yeah, from Enter the Dragon as well, there's a famous scene in that where he uses nunchucks, and that had to be cut out. Obviously, later on, that's since been restored. And there are other odd quirks of the British system where I believe it's the case where hitting somebody while they're unconscious is seen as a no-no. And that's something that might get cut out of a film or certainly trimmed from a film because it's very unsportsmanlike, is apparently the feeling behind that.
That's pretty interesting. By the way, Morgan, let's make note. We're probably going to have to do an episode on either the Ninja Turtles or nunchucks. So
yeah, we're gonna have to. I'm gonna have to take in one of my historical martial arts buddies to talk about some of that because, like, thinking about so the Ninja Turtles is what? It's the daggers, the swords, the stick, and then the nunchucks, right?
Yeah.
I feel like
correction. The appropriate term is sai, not dagger.
Yes.
I get corrected. I think he would have some interesting thoughts, especially when it comes to the quarterstaff versus the nunchucks, in terms of the ability to make them yourself and their lethality.
Yeah, well, I'm unfortunately I can't help you much as to why nunchucks were considered an illegal weapon in the UK, but sword wasn't at the time. Since then, the laws have changed, but I guess that might even go back to medieval times as to why a sword isn't an illegal weapon. But yeah, obviously the quarterstaff is easier to get a long stick, but it wasn't considered an illegal weapon in the UK.
Anyway.
Yeah, I think we're on a Ninja Turtles based tangent at this point.
Yeah. Just to let you know, I don't know if you know this, but the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the UK were called the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles because the powers that be thought that ninja was too violent a term.
I was going to bring that up, and then I figured we were getting stuck on the Ninja Turtles thing. So, but thank you.
I just wanted to make sure you were aware of that.
I was looking up, filmmakers or films that were directly influenced by the video nasty era, and this movie that I actually own it, but I haven't watched it yet. Censor, from last year.
I haven't seen it, but I saw something recently that the actress in it was in, and it was brought to my attention again. It was on my radar, yeah. James Furman was a divisive figure, but when you actually look at his history, there are some weird choices, but largely he was on the side of the filmmakers. There was something that he disliked about The Exorcist.
Was it just the whole religious aspect? I mean, I know there's it was a big deal in the U.S. too, The Exorcist. My mom told me about when it came out and just the kind of general fervor around how seemingly anti-Christian it was. There's the infamous scene of the crucifix masturbation. And
no, interesting. Well, according to the Wikipedia page, which does have a link to an article about it, we never had the religious fervor over that. It was James Furman's reasons were that the age of the possessed girl being under 12 meant that the film might appeal to underage viewers, and the reports of incidents of hysteria involving young women leading to the concerns that the film might cause severe emotional problems in those who believed that they could be demonically possessed.
That's really interesting because that's a little bit more of a, seemingly anyway, sensible reason to be concerned about something, right? And I almost want to say somewhat socially progressive, at least for the time, to be concerned about, how women had historically been viewed as being possessed, especially around their menstruation and everything.
It certainly seems like a more nuanced take. And having said that, the film was never officially banned in the UK. This was a case where we sort of went a little bit like the American system, where it wasn't allowed to be released on video due to the BBFC censors, but it could be shown in cinemas. But no cinema would show it because of the backlash. So yeah, it's interesting that the reasons given were that it might appeal to children because it featured a child, which I think, again, was a common reason for cutting or banning certain films that Furman believed in. If
that part's a little bit silly.
Yes, it feels a little bit silly because, it's the attitude of, well, if it's got a kid in it, kids will want to see it.
Right.
It's a little bit backwards. But, the idea that people who believed in demonic possession might see it and think they were possessed if they were highly suggestible. Yeah, it feels a little more nuanced.
Even an international look at how The Exorcist was received is probably pretty interesting because, over here, when you hear about people complain about The Exorcist, it is largely the religious elements, and to hear that it was, I would almost describe what Ryan's describing as almost a clinical approach to issues with the movie. Even if I don't 100% agree with what they were getting at, it seems a little more rationally based than some religious sensibilities.
Which makes me think of, when by the way, yes, a lot of the stuff we'll be covering on this podcast will, just by nature of the topic, will originate in the right-wing sphere and religious spheres as well. But there are going to be topics we touch on, such as the PMRC hearings, obscene or offensive music or whatever hearings, which was led by Tipper Gore. And more liberal politicians. There are examples where that happens, and maybe there's more nuance to these examples generally than other moral panics that originate in the right. But the function is essentially the same, even if the concern is somewhat more grounded. The function's the same, censorship, and the effect tends to be kind of almost like a rebellion against that attempt, right?
Right. With a pushback.
And there's a brilliant documentary about The Exorcist by the British film critic Mark Kermode, because it's his favourite film. So that's worth seeking out as well, which talks about the making of the film primarily, but also talks about some of the issues surrounding it. But the other one, which is actually considered a video nasty and misattributed to video nasties, often by people who you would consider slightly more left-leaning and liberal, is A Clockwork Orange, which I believe has always been available in the US, but was never actually banned by the BBFC in the UK. It was withdrawn by Stanley Kubrick himself, who lived here at the time, up until his death, and he was advised to withdraw it by the police after he received death threats towards him and his family. And
that's interesting.
Holy shit.
And because of reports in the British press that suggested there were copycat violence attributed to the film.
That is pretty interesting. I didn't know the movie had that much history outside of its own.
I knew that it had been pulled, and I maybe knew at some point that it was Kubrick, but that seems like the kind of thing that often gets passed around as it got banned temporarily or something like that, when it's more nuanced than that, and definitely worth looking into in the future. So like since then, have any has the government or probably not Mary Whitehouse, but has anybody expressed any type of we were being a little silly, a little bit of regret over the whole reaction, or did it just kind of go away and nobody ever mentioned it again? Or
it almost went away completely and was never mentioned again. Margaret Thatcher was removed as leader of her own party in 1990 by her party, and there's no way she would have ever been apologetic about any of her decisions that she made. Mary Whitehouse, up until her death, and she lived to a ripe old age, was always a true believer that society was on a steep decline to hell, and that her way was the only way. And the tabloid press have remarkable short memories for people who report on the news, and unless they're told to under threat of prosecution, they never apologize for anything. So there was no real suggestion that anybody involved in this was sorry for what they did. I believe James Furman actually did have some things to say about some of the decisions he made, and how he might have, in some cases, been more censorious than he should have been, and in some cases less censorious. But he was really the only figure involved in this whole thing that really had any comment to say about the rights and wrongs of it after it sort of dwindled and died out. Having said that, there was one last gasp, which is where we have to get a bit serious for the moment, just to explain the backstory of this. In the early 90s, in February of 1993, a 2-year-old boy in Liverpool was kidnapped by 2 10-year-old boys who tortured and then murdered him. His name was James Bulger. And they were quickly caught on early CCTV at the time and were later charged and convicted. But one of the weird sort of hanging on of the Video Nasties moral panic is that the tabloid media were desperate for an angle as to why this happened. I mean, everybody was questioning why and how something like this could have happened. And the true answer is that some people sometimes do unspeakable things, but the tabloid were desperate for a scapegoat, and they felt that they found one by blaming the film industry, specifically Child's Play 3, which was the latest film in that series at the time.
Sure. I know it well. I'm just kind of curious what from that film exactly would have they try to tie that to.
Well, the interesting thing, well, the reason behind that was, besides the fact that it was the latest and it contains the words Child's Play, which sort of leads them roughly in that direction, was that the father of one of the boys had rented the film a few weeks before they had kidnapped Bulger. However, the father wasn't living with the boy at the time, and there's very little evidence, to no evidence, that he ever saw that film before he committed the crime. Obviously, having seen the film, you'll know that there's very little in the film that suggests that it would inspire this, other than I believe that Bulger was covered in paint in the same color paint that is in the film.
Yeah, there's the infamous scene, at least in my mind, I remember it being, pretty, not shocking, but like it was memorable in toward the end when Chucky, the killer doll, the whole thing takes place at a boot camp, kids boot camp for young boys, juvenile kind of boot camp. And they're doing these war games with paintball guns. And at one point, the night before they're supposed to have their big battle, one team versus the other out in the woods, Chucky goes in and changes all of the bullets, all of the paintballs on one team to actual bullets, which, anybody that knows how these things work knows that you can't do that. But in the movie, he did. And then so you have one team, shooting actual bullets at the others.
Get those weapons in the air. I want to see them high.
And grueling drills. It couldn't possibly get any worse.
Wrong again, wimp.
Chucky's back.
Really gotta get out of this body.
He's looking for a new recruit.
I got some fresh meat lined up, and I'm not gonna let you spoil it.
Now,
just think, Chucky's gonna be a bro. Regulate this.
And yeah, I really still don't see it. That's a reach. I'll say that it's a reach. The closest thing I could think of is maybe, and this is just trying to give it benefit of the doubt, even though there really is none, that there was some bullying in it. So like, a couple of kids bullying another kid, but that's something you could get in any movie, really. Yeah, it's tragic and definitely, sad that when any kid is harmed in that way, and it's also tragic in terms of the kids that did it. But as you said, people that are inclined to do terrible things are going to do them regardless of, whatever media they consume.
I've just double checked as well, and actually, that was a rumor that was in the press at the time that wasn't actually to do with the story. The connection with the paintballing scene.
Well, I mean, still, that even highlights this whole thing further, right? Is how much these little bits, these memes of information like that enter, public consciousness and get passed around. And even in a podcast of three people who are trying to keep our facts straight, they can slip in there.
Yes, exactly. And the results of all this tabloid furore were that the film was not actually banned, but there was consumer pressure that meant that no shop would stock the film for several years afterwards. So that's an example where the BBFC didn't have an issue with the film itself because they didn't believe that it would result in these sorts of copycat cases that this apparently was, but then obviously in the benefit of hindsight we know had nothing to do with it. But consumer pressure was actually whipped up by the press to have the film removed from shelves.
And that's kind of another, like a secondary form of censorship in a way, right? Like the social pressure of that type of thing, where it very well could have just been video stores being considerate of their potential liability if they stocked that, and it's kind of a soft censorship, right?
Right, that social pressure.
Yeah.
You saw that with a similar event around the stabbing of a young girl by two of her classmates in Waukesha, Wisconsin, that were Slenderman stabbing. Yep. And how that had a whole furor about internet access and what should be blocked, and should we be mandating internet access and internet censorship. And a lot of things were made up in the aftermath of that it's hard to keep track of at the time. And I don't know that I could keep track of it today if I were to investigate it more.
But that's the recurring thread with all of these examples, I think, is, just there's these types of reactions tend to, they have to find an enemy and a cause for it. Like you were saying, Ryan, they searched and they found Child's Play 3 because it was just probably the latest thing that just saying the name to, more pearl clutching types of adults, parents, was going to get their attention. And, it's the same thing whether we're talking about rap music, which is an episode we're going to do. Sorry to promote future episodes so much, but there's a lot of recurring themes here. Like rap music, where if we stop rappers from saying these certain things, then there won't be violence or whatever. Or video games, if these violent video games are making kids be violent and so on, despite the fact that statistically, if that was true, then there'd be far more violence. Because of how many kids actually play the games.
Well, that's why the Child's Play 3 incident is so different from the rest of the Video Nasties situation that had happened for the previous 15 years by that point, is that there was never an inciting incident with earlier Video Nasties. There were no direct links ever made, either in the press or by politicians, between the films that they wanted to censor or ban and actual violence. And it was only when the tabloid media picked up on this loose connection and created consumer pressure that really that was the successful evolution of the Video Nasties moral panic, the moral panic that had no panic. Now they had the panic.
Right. It was like a panic in search of a problem, right?
Exactly.
A reaction in search of a problem. It's bizarre.
It seems to be a recurring theme.
Yep, I'll have to get better about not calling out the recurring themes because I imagine they're going to pop up quite a bit.
We're going to hear some of this a lot. The problem, or the panic and looking for a problem, religious groups, politicians just looking to latch onto something that they can push their agenda through with, I suspect that's going to keep coming up for some weird reason.
And also the think of the children angle.
Yeah, true.
I'm actually really curious now, and I guess we'll find out eventually, like what the percentage of these types of panics are that basically the think of the children. It's probably got to be 90% of the examples.
We should come up with a rating scale for or a checklist of like a bingo card. Ooh, we could do bingo cards.
Yeah, good times. Let's do it.